if you look at rates of things like depression and anxiety and suicidality, they're highest in the most developed and like modernized countries of the world. Why is that? You know what I'm saying? From a materialistic assumption, you would assume that suicidality should be much greater in, say, India than Sweden, because India is in general, like, much poorer and like whatever, more chaotic and all of that, than a place like Sweden, which is very, there's hardly like a poor person. There's this very large social network system and a nanny state and all of this. But in reality, I mean, it could have to do with the weather too. It's like very long winters and all of that. But, you find suicidality very high in places like that, right? Like people are suffering from a deep inner sense of hopelessness and of depression and all of that. And you go to some other societies that they have a lot fewer material goods, but they still have like some sense of, humanity and togetherness and all of this. And although their lives might be very difficult, just physically speaking, compared to some of these more affluent countries, like you find that they actually don't really suffer as much from things like, I'm not saying it doesn't exist in these places, but in general, like you don't, the level of just kind of clinical depression and suicidality and actual suicide and all of that are much lower in many of these countries that people in the West would think, okay, if anyone should be miserable, it should be people over there, because look, they don't have all of these material goods that we have. And of course, the lesson is, well, maybe there's more to life than just material goods. Like, of course, we enjoy our creature comforts, but that can't be all there is to it, right? And if you think that's all there is to it, you probably end up being very empty on the inside and therefore very depressed, right? And we do see that in in phenomena like in Japan, right, which really jumped onto this kind of modern Western bandwagon, although it's a very different place culturally than, say, Western Europe. You find many of these trends as well, like people not getting married, people not forming relationships, many old people dying, and they're alone in an apartment, and people don't discover their bodies until like weeks and months later. There's like a whole phenomenon of companies who their whole brand is like, we go and clean out apartments that people have discovered like rotting bodies in. Basically, it's like very morbid. Like there are companies who that's what they do. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. And
because it's a phenomenon, and probably in India, I would imagine, because it's like there's, first of all, so many people, but like everyone's like living all together. Like it's probably pretty unimaginable that someone could die and not be discovered for like 3 weeks, let alone 3 months, because everyone's always living together. And I didn't see the grandmother today where she didn't come to breakfast. Like it's impossible not to. Like, how could someone die alone and not be discovered for 3-4 weeks? Like that's probably impossible.
And what we face here is, many people here have this trend of, going and studying abroad or doing a job abroad. They have this kind of idea, Lord, this is fascinating to me, I'll go. And many of my friends who went to the West, lived in these Western countries, in Canada, US, when they call me, when I talk to them, or when they come back, they say life over there is very tough. Yeah, they might have good infrastructure, but life is so lonely, it's so depressed. People behave in a very different way. Here, like, when they come back, they always feel like, I'm just waiting to come back here, because over here, we have family systems, we care for each other, and there's this kind of happiness that you can see. In fact, even when I travel to Africa, I would say in Africa, people face a lot of adversity from a materialistic perspective. But I've been in Africa for months, but I see this kind of harmony between societies there, and this kind of happiness that you can see from your own eyes, that, which maybe is something that is lacking in a society which has adopted more of the modernist assumptions. Would you agree with that? Have you seen something like that?
I mean, absolutely. I would say, like, also, if you read one book that's very interesting to read, I have it somewhere back here. It's The Road to Mecca by Muhammad Asad.
Yeah.
Muhammad Asad was born as a Jew in Austria in the, I guess, late 1800s. His name was Leopold Weiss, and he went to Palestine, particularly in the 1915, like the teens, and he was a reporter for an Austrian newspaper. And then he ended up staying, and he converted to Islam and so forth. But he speaks in that book about, after going to the Muslim world and experiencing a different way of life and a different way of looking at things in a different culture, he went back to Europe and was just so struck by how, and this was 100 years ago, right? Back when Europe was not as far down the path as they are today. People were still going to church back then, and it was still much more traditional than today. But nevertheless, he said, you would sit on a train in Europe, Austria, Germany, wherever, and you would just look at the faces of people across you, and they're just blank. Like there's no life. They're just kind of like shells. Right. And he just said, I realized that the people were just like empty on the inside. And this was 100 years ago, and again, like we're much, much further along this development now, quote unquote, development in the West now than 100 years ago. So he was saying this 100 years ago. Right. But he could already see that the paradigm, again, it's the paradigm that had been put in place was already having very palpable effects on people's skeptic. People were skeptical. They were kind of hardened. They were, pessimistic, not enthusiastic about life. They were very much kind of enjoying their creature comforts and all of that. But if you just dig a little bit beneath the surface, you find like just a shell. Like there isn't actual, life and vibrancy and optimism and purpose and, right. And he saw that when he went to places like, the Near East and Arabia and all of that, like people physically and materially had a lot less, right? And you don't always have to have less. Like you could also have material goods, but also, be spiritually grounded as well. I mean, this is possible. And we do have people in our history. Some of the Sahaba were very wealthy, actually. They made a lot of money in the market, but like in the end of the day, they could have lost all of it and it wouldn't have changed their heart, right? Their heart was with Allah. And they said, the dunya, if you have the dunya, it should be in your hand and not in your heart. So if you have the dunya is not bad necessarily, as long as it's in your hand and not in your heart, right? So we're not saying, we're not like, the point is not to, kind of romanticize poverty or something, right? I'm not saying that, but the idea is that, again, everything has to be kept in a proper hierarchy, right? If you have the proper starting assumptions and you're integrating everything into a proper worldview, then you can incorporate a certain amount of wealth and affluence and physical comfort. You can incorporate that into your larger vision without losing your vision, right? Without making that your vision, right? So it really is a matter, I think, of the paradigm with which you are approaching the world.